Protecting the vote, that is the topic of tonight's Byline. Quebecers are voting today. And you know what they aren't allowed to do in Quebec? Vouch. Yep, we've been hearing for weeks in Ottawa that not allowing people to vote in a federal election when they have no ID at all, well, that's an affront to democracy. At the federal level, we've allowed people with none of the 39 odd pieces of ID that you can use to still vote if another registered voter vouches for them. NDP leader Tom Mulcair thinks it's undemocratic to stop this practice. So does Liberal leader Justin Trudeau.
Perhaps up to 120,000 people could be disenfranchised, Canadian voters prevented from voting in the next election because of this bill.
You can't have a democratic election with what he's putting forward. Removing people's right to vote is the exact wrong direction to be going in.
Two Quebec politicians attacking a move by the federal government to tighten our elections laws that still wouldn't make it as tough as the laws that voters in Quebec have when it comes to ID. Voters in Quebec receive a reminder card that looks like this. Now, I want everyone to note the card's bilingual. I voted in Quebec in English, no problem at all, but they are picky on the ID. It says right on there that you have to have one of the 5 pieces of ID. Your health insurance card, your driver's license, your Canadian passport, your certificate of Indian status, or your Canadian Forces ID. Note that 3 out of the 5 of them are federal pieces of ID. Quebec's message is simple. If you want to vote, you get your ID, you register, you vote. Where are the cries that Quebec is undemocratic, that this election is illegitimate? Where are the calls by Justin Trudeau and Tom Mulcair to change the voting laws in their home province? Well, that's right. They don't have anything to say on that. Meanwhile, even with the changes brought in by the Fair Elections Act, you would still be able to vote by showing a combination of a credit card and your cable bill, or a letter from your homeless shelter and a hospital card. None of these confirm that I'm a Canadian citizen and therefore eligible to vote. And if I'm not on the register of voters, that's all I need to cast a ballot. I don't think the act goes far enough. But to the NDP, to the Liberals, and Sheila Fraser, our sainted and unquestionable former Auditor General, this is a horrible move. Here's Fraser on CBC Radio's The House.
The main issue is about being able to prove where you live. Because you need 2 pieces. You need to prove your identity, but you also need to prove where you live. And there are a lot of people who have difficulty doing that. And I think we've seen a lot of testimony from people, First Nations people, the blind, students. I mean, there are a number of people. I can think of my father who used to be in a nursing home. I mean, I don't know that he would have had ID that had his address on it.
Well, actually, Ms. Fraser, your father in a nursing home would have been aided in voting. Sometimes they bring the ballot boxes to people's rooms to help them vote, and his patient ID bracelet would count as one of the forms of ID acceptable in a federal election. This woman doesn't know what she's talking about, a point she hammers home moments later when she says, none of us will have street addresses when Canada Post stops door-to-door delivery.
And I wonder, too, and it just crossed my mind the other day, what will happen when Canada Post changes the way they deliver mail? And I presume we will all have post office box numbers or box numbers. We won't have an address.
We won't have an address. And all Evan Solomon, the host of the show, can say to that is, What this tells me, folks, is that this interview was really just a pair of out-of-touch urban elitists who've never lived in the suburbs or bothered to find out how the hoi polloi live. Canada Post has been delivering to community mailboxes for nearly 30 years, and those people still have street addresses. The millions of Canadians that live in rural areas, well, they have a street address as well, even if they also have a P.O. box. But if you live in Rockcliffe in Ottawa or in the finer neighborhoods of Montreal, which is where Ms. Fraser lived before moving to Ottawa, then you don't know how the help lives. Did you catch what I said there? Ms. Fraser is another Quebecer denouncing what the feds are doing, but she's silent on Quebec's limited 5 pieces of ID system. Listen, this is about protecting the vote. I'm not going to sit here and say that every part of the Fair Elections Act is perfect, but I find it odd that the media, the opposition, and the experts are running a campaign against the bill based on vouching and voter fraud that sounds like it comes straight out of the Democratic playbook south of the border. Supporters keep saying there's no voter fraud in Canada, so we don't need this change. Well, allow me again to point you to the testimony of William Corbett, the former chief investigator at Elections Canada. He was asked about voting in 2006, where a sitting Conservative MP, Jeremy Harrison, lost by about 67 votes. A single Native Reserve reported their results 3 hours late. Pretty much everyone there voted Liberal, and more people voted than were registered. And by the way, hundreds of them were vouched for. It sounds like voter fraud to me, but Corbett didn't think so.
In your investigation, did you raise any possibility of voter fraud? Did you consider that as an option?
Well, what kind of voter fraud would you be?
Stuffing the ballot box?
No, we didn't find that. We didn't find that.
See no evil, hear no evil. Look, there are real problems at Elections Canada, including a chief electoral officer that's supposed to be neutral, but well, he's anything but neutral. Right now, though, the fight is over voter ID, and just like in the U.S., it has for some reason split left-right. This shouldn't be a left-right issue. If you can't pull together enough ID over a 37-day campaign to vote, then you don't take voting seriously, and we shouldn't stretch the rules to let you cast a ballot. You want to vote? Prove that you're a citizen, prove that you are who you say you are, and prove where you live, meaning that you're eligible to vote. Now, until the critics like Ms. Fraser, Mr. Mulcair, and Mr. Trudeau start attacking Quebec in the same way they do now, then I know that they're just supporting the continuation of voter fraud, because that's what the current system encourages. And that's the byline.
We have to ask questions. That is our responsibility. That is important for us to respect the process of votation in Quebec. That is the rule of our democracy.
Something, Pauline Marouin, I can actually agree on. It happens from time to time. You should, be able to prove who you are. You say who you are. The Quebec election is our top story. Monty Solberg joins me now because he's got a great column in today's Sun newspapers. And Monty, this is you comparing. You're looking at the fact that Alberta is about to replace Quebec as the second biggest economy in the country. That should be staggering to everyone.
It should be big news, and you would think it'd be front and center in the Quebec election campaign, because I can't think of a province full of people more proud of who they are than Quebecers. And you'd think, they would be very concerned at the prospect of those, as I said in my column, those gap-toothed hicks out in Alberta are going to surpass them in terms of economic might. But it barely, the issue of the economy barely came up during the election campaign, or at least wasn't a big issue. And certainly the issue of Quebec losing its place didn't come up at all, and it's all a bit of a surprise.
Let me put this a bit in perspective here. Alberta has roughly 4 million people. Quebec about 7.5. Yeah. Your economy in Alberta surpassing Quebec, I mean, you're almost just over half their population.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's, on a per capita basis, the numbers are huge. And look, Alberta is blessed with all this oil wealth. But the crazy thing is, Quebec sits on the Utica Shale as well. They have the prospect of going and exploiting that and developing their oil and gas reserves. They just haven't done it. I'm so shocked that a province that is so deep in debt as Quebec and has so many economic problems, that this wasn't sort of the front and center issue in the election campaign. But as you know, Brian, it wasn't. You would think that, the future of Quebecers economically would also be tied actually to whether or not they could become a separate country at some point. But it wasn't even raised in that context, really, or if it wasn't taken seriously.
Yeah, well, it wasn't front and center the way it should have been. Quebec and Ontario should not be have-not provinces. They shouldn't be getting money from the feds. Both provinces are blessed. As you say, Quebec has the Utica Shale. They've got Old Harry out there. They could be developing their natural resources, but they decide not to because the rest of the country they'll pay for it. But here's real GDP growth. Quebec is way at the bottom, 1% GDP growth compared to 3.9% in Alberta. Monty, if you're a lefty, and in my view, every single one of the parties in Quebec is a left-wing party, you want to be able to spend on social programs. You need economic growth and you need jobs. Shouldn't that register with them?
Well, you can't redistribute the wealth until you've created it. And the crazy thing is Quebec actually there is a history of entrepreneurship in Quebec. You still see it down in the Beauce region in the southern part of Quebec. And, I think one of these days someone will be the leader in Quebec who reminds people of this and rallies people around the idea that Quebec can be an engine of growth once again. They have the resources. They have access to the largest, most important market in the world, the United States, 25% of the world's economy. And they have a a manufacturing base that's still there and could be reignited. But so far, no one has brought that leadership forward. Instead, all they have is ever-growing government, more bureaucracy, and the specter of separation that hangs over their head and drives away investment. So they're not doing anything right at this point, and they're essentially ceding leadership on these things to provinces in the West.
All right, well, if they don't wake up when Alberta passes them, maybe, as you point out, they will when BC passes them within the next decade. Monty, good talking as always.
Yeah, thanks very much, Brian.